The shudder of the old sedan was a death rattle, a final violent cough before the engine fell into a terminal silence. Elena, 32, rested her forehead against the cold steering wheel, the cracked plastic pressing a temporary pattern into her skin. Outside, the world was a blur of indifferent twilight, but inside this metal shell, her world had shrunk to the smell of stale air, spilled gasoline, and the damp chill that had settled deep into her bones. They were officially stranded. The eviction notice, a single sheet of paper now crumpled in the glove compartment, had been a sentence. This silence was the execution. She felt her heart constrict, a tight, painful fist in her chest. The car wasn't just a car anymore. It was their home, their shelter, and now it was their tomb. Each gust of wind that rocked the chassis was a reminder of their complete and utter vulnerability, exposed on the shoulder of a road that led from nowhere to nothing. A single, silent tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Her entire net worth lay spread on the passenger seat, illuminated by the dying glow of her phone's screen. $47, 4 creased $10 bills, a 5 dawn, 2 ones, and a pathetic handful of loose change. She counted it for the 10th time, as if the numbers might magically rearrange themselves. Her stomach ached with a hollow, gnawing hunger that had become a constant companion. In the back, their only bag of clothes was a lumpy silhouette, smelling faintly of mildew and defeat. Dinner was 2 saltine crackers each, washed down with a sip of lukewarm water from a plastic jug that was less than a quarter full. The cracker dust felt like sand in her dry mouth. She felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat, a physical rejection of their reality. This wasn't living. It was a slow, agonizing process of disappearing. Every decision was a calculation of survival. Use the phone battery to search for a shelter, or save it in case of an emergency. But the emergency was already here, breathing down her neck. A sound from the back seat ripped through her thoughts, a wet, ragged cough that seemed to tear the air apart. It was Leo, her 7-year-old son, curled into a tight ball under a blanket so thin it was more of a suggestion than a comfort. Eleanor twisted in her seat, her hand instinctively reaching out to touch his forehead. It was hot, too hot. A clammy, feverish heat that spoke of an infection taking root. His shivering wasn't just from the cold, it was the violent tremors of a body at war with itself. A fresh spike of pure, cold panic pierced through the dull ache of her own misery. This was the fear that kept her awake at night, a suffocating terror that was far worse than hunger or homelessness. Her son was sick, and she had nothing. No medicine, no doctor, no warm bed, just $47 and a cough that was getting deeper, heavier and more frightening with every passing hour. She felt her breath catch in her throat, a sob she couldn't afford to release. Her fingers, calloused and nimble from a decade spent at a sewing machine, felt clumsy and useless now. She remembered the familiar hum of the machine, the steady rhythm that had been the soundtrack to her life, the scent of hot oil and fresh-pressed fabric. That life felt like it belonged to someone else, a ghost from a distant past. The pink slip had been impersonal, a corporate decision, but it had felt like an amputation. They had taken her livelihood, and with it, her identity. Now, the silence in the car was a roaring void, filled only by the whisper of the wind and Leo's labored breathing. The thought, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, lodged itself in her mind. We are not going to survive the week. It wasn't a dramatic premonition, it was a simple, brutal calculation. The water would run out, the crackers would be gone, the cold would seep in deeper. The fear was no longer an emotion, it was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. The last light of day bled out of the sky, painting the clouds in cruel, beautiful shades of orange and purple. As darkness settled, the temperature plummeted. Elena pulled the flimsy blanket tighter around Leo's small, trembling body, trying to shield him with her own. But she was shivering too. The $47 in her hand felt as thin and useless as a dead leaf. It was the total sum of her failures, a monument to every wrong turn and piece of bad luck. Through the fogged-up windows, the headlights of passing cars were like distant, indifferent stars in a galaxy she no longer belonged to. The world outside was moving, living, breathing, while she and her son were trapped in this freezing, static prison. Hope, which had flickered faintly just days ago, was now a dying ember in her chest, so small and weak that its faint warmth felt almost identical to the biting cold of her despair. The suffocating quiet pressed in, heavy and absolute, with her phone's battery icon flashing a final, desperate red. A frantic energy seized Elena. It was a madness born of pure desperation. She thought of the stories her grandmother used to tell, bedtime fables about eccentric, long-lost relatives. A name surfaced from the depths of her memory, a whisper from childhood, a great-uncle, a man who owned a picture palace in a town so small it was a speck of dust on the map. The name of the theater floated into her consciousness like a ghost. The Majestic. It was absurd, a fairy tale. But as Leo coughed again, a sound that seemed to splinter the cold silence, absurdity was all she had left. She felt the cold seeping into her bones, a damp, invasive chill that mirrored the dread icing her veins. Her fingers, trembling with a mixture of cold and adrenaline, hovered over the cracked phone screen. Her thumbs flew across the keyboard, typing the fragments of memory into the search bar. Elena Reyes Air, Great Uncle Cinema, The Majestic. The search felt futile. A last prayer whispered into a hurricane. The signal bars flickered between one and none. The screen glowed weakly, the only source of light in their suffocating metallic tomb. She held her breath, watching the spinning icon of a search in progress. It was the digital equivalent of a lottery ticket. A 1 in a billion chance she was cashing in with the last of her phone's life. The world outside the fogged-up windows was an impenetrable black, and she felt as if this tiny screen was her only connection to a world that had forgotten she existed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the dead engine. Then, something appeared, not a grand announcement, but a single, obscure link to a county clerk's website from a place she'd never heard of, Perdido County. She tapped it, her finger leaving a smudge on the screen. A PDF loaded with agonizing slowness. It was a probate document, a wall of dry, official text. But her name was there, Elena Reyes, and the words that followed made her breath catch in her throat. Sole living heir to the property located at 1 Main Street, Perdido, so known as the Majestic Cinema. She read the line again and again, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. It wasn't joy she felt, but a dizzying, violent shock. A roof. The phrase became a mantra in her mind. A roof over their heads. It was a fragile, unbelievable lifeline thrown into an ocean of despair. The decision was not a choice. It was an inevitability. It was a path that appeared in a trackless wasteland, and she had to take it. She looked at the fuel gauge, the needle resting defiantly below the ear. It would take every last drop of gasoline in the tank to get there. There was no margin for error, no turning back. She twisted the key. The engine protested, a series of clicks and groans. Then, miraculously, it caught. The sputtering roar was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. A surge of adrenaline, raw and powerful, coursed through her. The first positive emotion she had felt in what seemed like an eternity, even if it was laced with the sharp tang of terror. She glanced at Leo, asleep in the back, and whispered, "We're going to be okay." She had to believe it. She drove with a fierce, calm, protective focus, her eyes glued to the dark ribbon of asphalt. The landscape was a monotonous stretch of dark fields and skeletal trees silhouetted against a starless sky. Every mile that clicked over on the odometer was a small victory, a step away from the roadside grave they had narrowly escaped. Inside the car, the only sounds were the strained hum of the engine, the whistle of the wind through a leaky window seal, and Leo's soft, shallow breaths. She rationed her hope just as she had rationed their crackers, not allowing herself to imagine too much, lest the disappointment be too great. The image of a solid roof, any roof, was a beacon burning in the darkness of her mind, guiding her through the oppressive night. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse light. The loneliness of the road was immense, a physical presence that pressed in on all sides, amplifying her own isolation. Her body was a knot of aches and pains, her shoulders tight with tension, her eyes stinging from exhaustion and the glare of the dashboard lights. Yet she pushed on, fueled by a potent cocktail of fear and a desperate budding hope. She passed through towns that were little more than a collection of boarded-up windows and silent, empty streets, places that had given up the ghost long ago. She felt a kinship with them, but she refused to surrender. Hope was a cruel taskmaster, demanding every last ounce of her energy and resolve. The sign for Perdido was almost completely swallowed by overgrown ivy, her single wooden plank riddled with rot and hanging at a drunken angle. The town itself was more a collection of shadows than a community. A few dilapidated houses, their windows dark and vacant like empty eye sockets, stood sentinel along a single unpaved road. A general store with a sagging porch roof looked as though a strong gust of wind would reduce it to a pile of splintered wood. The silence was the most unsettling part. It was not a peaceful quiet, but an ancient, heavy stillness that felt deeply wrong. A chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature crawled up Elena's spine. This wasn't a town. It was a memory of a town. And then she saw it. At the far end of the desolate street, a dark, monstrous shape loomed against the pale pre-dawn sky. It was larger than she had imagined, a hulking silhouette that must have been grand once, a testament to a bygone era of dreams and flickering lights. The word majestic was still faintly visible on the crumbling facade, though the J had fallen off, and the S hung precariously by a single bolt. The fragile hope that had sustained her for the past 100 miles began to curdle in her stomach. It felt like walking toward the source of a nightmare, not a dream. The building didn't look like salvation. It looked like a tombstone marking the grave of a whole town's aspirations, including, she feared, her own. As she pulled the car to a stop, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died with a final metallic sigh. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, broken only by the mournful whistle of wind through the building's broken bones. The faint grey light of dawn crept over the horizon, cruelly illuminating the full extent of the decay. The grand arched entrance was boarded up with mismatched planks of wood, covered in the faded, peeling ghosts of movie posters from decades past. Long strips of paint hung from the brick walls like shedding skin, revealing the crumbling mortar beneath. The word dilapidated was an insult to the profound state of ruin before her. This wasn't just neglected, it was a corpse of a building. Elena forced her car door open, the rusty hinges screaming in protest. The first thing that hit her was the smell. It was a thick, gag-inducing miasma that clawed at the back of her throat. The primary note was rot, the damp, earthy perfume of decay, of wood turned to mulch and fabric dissolving into dust. Underneath it was the sharp, acrid stench of animal waste, a potent cocktail of bat guano and generations of rat droppings. It was the smell of utter and complete abandonment, a smell that spoke of years, decades, of silent neglect. The nausea she had felt in the car returned with a vengeance, and she had to physically swallow it back down, her stomach churning in rebellion. This was the smell of her new home. She found a side door hanging precariously from a single hinge and pushed it open. It groaned open into a chasm of darkness. Patches of grey morning light filtered through gaping holes in the roof high above, illuminating thick, swirling columns of dust as if they were solid things. The sound of her own hesitant footsteps echoed unnervingly in the vast, cavernous space. Somewhere in the dark, water dripped with a slow, maddeningly regular rhythm, a metronome counting down the building's final moments. The sound of rats scurrying in the walls was a constant, unnerving whisper, the rustle of their tiny claws on unseen surfaces sending a shiver down her spine. Her hope was now a tiny, flickering candle in a hurricane. As her eyes adjusted, the true horror of the interior revealed itself. She saw rows and rows of seats, but their once plush velvet was shredded to ribbons, exposing the yellowed, decaying foam and rusted springs within. They looked like 1,000 open mouths, screaming in silent agony. A thick, fuzzy carpet of green and black mold covered everything: the walls, the seats, the tattered remains of a golden curtain on the stage. It looked like a living, breathing organism, slowly digesting the theater from the inside out. The air was frigid, colder inside than it was out, the gaping holes in the roof acting like funnels for the biting wind. This place offered no protection, no shelter. It was an actively hostile environment. The fragile hope that had carried her all this way shattered into a million sharp pieces. This wasn't a solution. It was a new, more profound level of hell. This was a bigger, colder, more dangerous version of the homeless shelter she had so desperately feared. Her heart which had been pounding with a frantic, hopeful rhythm, now plummeted into her stomach like a stone. A cold, heavy despair, far worse than the desperation she'd felt in the car, settled over her. That had been the fear of the unknown. This was the brutal, concrete horror of a known and inescapable reality. She felt her knees weaken, a physical manifestation of her spirit breaking under the immense weight of this final, cruel deception. She turned to get Leo from the car, a sick, hollow feeling in her gut. How could she bring her sick child into this place? He was awake as she unbuckled him, his fever-bright eyes wide in the gloom. He didn't cry or complain. He just stared at the cavernous, rotting space with the unfiltered, terrified honesty of a child. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound that echoed horribly in the vast emptiness, each cough a small explosion in the dead silence. He burrowed his face into her shoulder, his small body trembling not just from fever, but from fear. His silent terror was 1,000 times more damning than any accusation. She had led him from one danger directly into the jaws of a greater one. Standing in the center of the decaying movie palace, holding her sick, silent son, Elena finally understood the true meaning of being alone. The $47 were gone, burned away on the desperate journey here. The car was dead. They were 100 miles from anywhere, trapped in a building that felt like it was actively trying to collapse on top of them. The last glimmer of hope had been a mirage, and now the desert was all she could see. She felt a scream building in her chest, a primal howl of grief and rage and terror, but it died in her throat, strangled by the sheer weight of her despair. There was no one to hear it. This was the bottom. There was nowhere left to fall. The deep, damp cold of the place seeped into her bones. A final definitive chill. There was no choice but to try and carve out a space from the ruin. Survival was an act of will, and Eleanor's will, though battered, was not yet broken. Her focus narrowed to the stage. It was slightly raised, drier than the mold-infested floor, and offered a semblance of a defensible position against the cold and the unseen vermin. She began to work with a grim, methodical energy. Using a broken piece of a seat frame as a makeshift broom, she scraped away the thickest layers of filth. The dust rose in choking clouds, catching in the weak beams of morning light like malevolent spirits. The sound was a harsh, rhythmic scratching that echoed in the vast silence, the only sign of life in the decaying mausoleum. Her muscles screamed in protest, unused to this kind of raw, physical labor. Every sweep of the wood was a small war waged against the overwhelming decay, a tiny, defiant act of claiming this one small corner as their own. The smell of disturbed mold and ancient dust was suffocating, filling her lungs and coating the back of her throat. She cleared a small patch of dusty floorboards, a space barely larger than a coffin, but it was theirs. She laid down the thin, damp blanket from the car, the only soft thing they owned in the world. It looked pathetic and inadequate against the grime, a tiny island in an ocean of rot. Leo, who had been watching her with wide, silent eyes, seemed to understand. He coughed, a sound that was immediately swallowed by the immense space, and sat down on the edge of the blanket, clutching a small, red toy car in his hand. It was a cheap plastic thing, a relic from a happier time, its bright color a shocking contrast to the monochrome decay surrounding them. He didn't complain about the cold or the smell. His quiet compliance was a knife in Elena's heart. She felt the familiar burn of tears behind her eyes but forced it down. She could not afford to cry. Crying was a luxury for those who had the energy to spare, and hers was being consumed by the simple, brutal act of existing. To distract him, to create a fleeting moment of normalcy, she tried to force a smile. "Look, Leo, a stage. You're a star." The words felt hollow and absurd in her own mouth. He gave her a weak, fleeting smile in return, his little hand pushing the red car across the dusty floorboards. It rolled smoothly for a moment, then wobbled and picked up speed on the slight incline of the stage. Elena watched it go, a tiny spark of motion in the stillness. It rolled past a collection of debris, past a pile of shredded curtain, heading directly for the massive, tattered movie screen that still hung like a ghostly shroud at the back of the stage. The car disappeared behind the heavy, mold-stained fabric with a faint, rattling clatter. Leo's face fell. It was the only toy he had, and it was gone. "Mama," he whispered, his voice small and trembling, pointing a finger toward the screen. The small loss felt monumental, another tiny cut in a tapestry of gaping wounds. Elena sighed, her breath a white puff in the frigid air. A wave of bone-deep weariness washed over her. Every small task felt like a mountain to be climbed. Still, she could not deny him this. "I'll get it, baby." She walked to the back of the stage, the floorboards groaning under her weight with a sound like a dying man's last breath. The screen was enormous, far larger up close, its fabric stiff with age and dampness. The smell of decay was strongest here. She pulled the heavy curtain aside, stepping into the narrow, dark space between it and the back wall. It was pitch black, and the air was thick with the scent of spiders and time itself. She crouched down, her hand sweeping across the filthy floor, searching for the small piece of plastic. Her fingers brushed against dust bunnies, unseen filth, and the gritty texture of the floor. She felt the cold of the concrete wall against her knuckles as she reached deeper into the darkness. Her searching fingers, calloused from years of needlework, suddenly froze. The cold, gritty surface of the concrete back wall had abruptly changed. Under her fingertips, the texture was different. It was smoother, warmer. It was wood, old, dry wood, expertly disguised with a layer of plaster and paint to blend seamlessly with the surrounding concrete. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, snaked its way up her spine. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thud against her ribs. This wasn't a repair. It was intentional. Her fingers traced the outline, feeling the faint, rectangular seam hidden beneath the grime. It was a panel, perfectly fitted. She ran her hand over it again, the surprise giving way to a sharp, electric jolt of curiosity. The absolute despair that had crushed her spirit just moments before receded, replaced by a new, powerful feeling. Mystery. Her eyes, now adjusting to the gloom behind the screen, scanned the area more closely. She pulled her phone out, its battery life now a precious, dwindling resource, and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut a sharp white circle through the darkness, illuminating the wall. She could see it clearly now, the faint but undeniable outline of a perfectly cut door or panel about a meter high. It was a masterful deception. Then, the beam of light drifted downward, catching on the floorboards. Her breath hitched in her throat. There, etched into the wood, were long, faint scratch marks. They weren't random. They were parallel lines, scars in the floor that led directly from the open space of the stage to the bottom edge of the hidden panel. Someone had dragged something heavy, something metallic, in and out of this secret place, many times. A cold dread, mixed with a feverish excitement, bloomed in her chest. This was not an accident of architecture. This was a secret, a hidden room, right here, beneath their feet. The stories of her eccentric great-uncle, the man who built this place, suddenly felt less like family folklore and more like a map. What had he been hiding? Why go to such lengths? The air behind the curtain felt thick with unspoken history, heavy with the weight of whatever was concealed behind that wall. She felt a primal magnetic pull toward it, an instinct that overwhelmed her fear. For the first time since they had arrived, a feeling other than pure, hopeless misery took hold. It was a dangerous, thrilling curiosity, a whisper of possibility in the deafening silence of her despair. She pushed on the panel with all her might, but it didn't budge. It was locked or barred from the inside. Frustration flared, hot and sharp. To be so close to something, anything, and be stopped by a simple lock felt like the universe was mocking her once more. She banged her fist against the wood, the dull thud echoing her own frustration. It was hollow, definitely hollow. The sound confirmed it. A room, a space. She needed leverage, a tool. Her mind raced, sifting through their pathetic inventory of possessions, and then it hit her. The car, the tire iron, the very tool meant to fix the vehicle that had become their prison, could now be the key to unlocking a deeper secret. The thought propelled her into motion. "Stay here, Leo," she commanded, her voice tight with a new, strange urgency. She pushed back through the heavy screen, her body thrumming with an adrenaline she hadn't felt in months. She scrambled out the broken side door, the sudden blast of cold, clean air, a shock after the stale tomb of the theatre. The dead sedan sat in the grey light like a steel carcass. She fumbled with the trunk, the lock rusted and stiff. With a wrench and a curse, she forced it open. There it was, lying next to the spare tire. The tire iron. It was heavy in her hand, cold and solid, a piece of brutal, functional steel. It felt like a weapon, a key, a promise. As she carried it back into the cavernous theater, the weight of the iron was a grounding force. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, driving resolve. She was no longer a passive victim of her circumstances. She was about to break into a secret. Back in the suffocating darkness behind the screen, she wedged the flattened end of the tire iron into the faint seam of the panel. She put her shoulder into it, leveraging her entire body weight. The old wood groaned in protest. A high-pitched screech of tortured nails echoed in the small space. She grunted with the effort, her muscles straining, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold. For a moment, nothing happened. The wood held fast, a silent guardian of its long-kept secret. She repositioned the iron, finding a better angle, and pushed again, this time with a surge of desperate strength. There was a sharp, explosive crack, like a gunshot in the silence. The sound of splintering wood. The seal was broken. A gust of air, impossibly ancient and stale, rushed out to meet her. It was a smell unlike any she had ever encountered. The dry, papery scent of forgotten books, the faint, metallic tang of rust, and a deep, earthy aroma like a freshly opened tomb. The smell was so thick it felt solid, a ghost of the past escaping its prison. The panel swung inward into darkness, revealing a cramped, black square. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. She shone her phone's light into the opening. It was a room, a small, hidden office, no larger than a closet, crammed with the ghosts of another life. The beam of light danced over walls lined with cobwebs as thick as cotton, illuminating a small dilapidated wooden desk and a single rotting chair. A shiver of awe and terror ran through her. She had done it. She had broken in. She squeezed through the opening, her feet landing on the dusty floor of the secret room with a soft thud. The silence in here was different. It was absolute, sealed off from the dripping water and whistling wind of the main theater. It was a time capsule. Dust motes, ancient and undisturbed for what must have been decades, swirled in the beam of her light like a galaxy of tiny stars. Her gaze fell on the desk, its surface covered in a thick, grey blanket of dust, and then she saw it, tucked into the dark, knee-hole space beneath the desk. It wasn't just a box. It was a heavy steel footlocker, dark and formidable, its surface showing blooms of rust. It was bound with two thick, metal clasps. This was what the scratches on the floor had meant. This was the heavy object that had been dragged back and forth. Her breath caught. She knelt before it, her fingers tracing the cold, rusted metal. It was heavy, solid. She tried to lift the lid, but it was locked tight with a large, old-fashioned padlock. Another barrier, another test, but she still had the tire iron. The adrenaline was roaring in her ears now, drowning out everything else. This was it. The answer to the mystery of the room was inside this chest. She wedged the sharp end of the iron into the shackle of the padlock, her hands trembling slightly. She leaned on it, using the chest itself for leverage. The metal shrieked in protest, a long grating sound that set her teeth on edge. The old rusted metal was no match for the focused power of the steel tool and her desperate strength. With a final, sharp snap, the padlock broke and clattered to the floor. The sound was deafening in the tiny, silent room. For a long moment, Elena just knelt there, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hand resting on the lid of the chest. This was the point of no return. Whatever was inside this box would change everything. She could feel it. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that was more dust than air, she braced herself and lifted the heavy steel lid. It creaked open, revealing the darkness within. A new smell wafted out, overwhelming the scent of dust and decay. It was the crisp, dry smell of old paper money and a rich, loamy, earthy scent that was strangely familiar, like a deep forest after a rain. Her phone's light spilled into the chest. Her gasp was sharp, audible. It was a fortune. Stacks and stacks of old currency, bound in crumbling paper bands. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life, but there was more. Tucked beside the stacks of cash were several small, dark velvet pouches, soft and heavy. Her trembling fingers reached for one. She pulled the drawstring open and tilted the contents into her palm. They weren't coins, they were stones, rough, green and glassy, catching the light with a deep internal fire. Raw, uncut emeralds, they felt cool and impossibly heavy in her hand, each one a universe of captured green light. Her mind reeled, unable to process the scale of the discovery. But beneath the emeralds, at the very bottom of the chest, lay one final object. It was a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with time. This, she knew with a sudden, chilling certainty, was the real treasure. The cold leather of the journal's cover felt like a human skin, ancient and brittle beneath Elena's trembling fingers. The scent rising from it was one of deep time, of dry paper, faded ink, and the sealed-in air of a forgotten decade. The fortune in the chest, the impossible stacks of money and the raw, glowing emeralds seemed to lose all meaning. They were just things. This book, she felt with a chilling certainty, was a story, a testament. Its weight in her hands felt far heavier than its physical mass suggested. It felt heavy with secrets, with a silence that had lasted for half a century and was now screaming to be broken. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm in the suffocating quiet of the secret room. She took a shallow, dusty breath and, with a sense of both dread and inevitability, she opened the cover. The first page was waiting for her, the handwriting an elegant, controlled script that felt like a voice from the grave about to speak for the very first time, and she wasn't sure she was ready to hear what it had to say. The brittle pages crackled softly as she turned them, the sound like whispering in the dead air. The ink, a faded blue-black, chronicled the life of her great-uncle, Ricardo Reyes. His early entries were filled with a palpable passion. He described himself not as a theatre owner, but as a gemologist, a lover of the earth's secret beauties. The majestic was his folly, his dream, a place to bring light and stories to a town drowning in dust and quiet desperation. He wrote about the science of light refraction in diamonds, the specific gravity of sapphires, and the unique crystalline structures found only in certain Colombian emeralds. Elena felt a strange kinship with this man she'd never met, a fellow artisan who found solace in precision and beauty. He was a creator, like her. She could almost smell the hot projector bulbs and the sweet scent of popcorn he described, ghosts of a life that had once filled this hollow, rotting shell. It was the diary of a dreamer, and it made the coming darkness all the more terrifying to anticipate. Then, the tone of the journal shifted. A new name appeared, scrawled with a slightly heavier, more hesitant hand, Mr. Valeriano, the Colonel, as the townspeople called him. Even then, Ricardo described him not as a man, but as a force of nature, a figure of immense and unnerving power who was buying up land with a relentless, predatory hunger. His descriptions were vivid, painting a picture of a man with a smile like a razor cut, and eyes that held the flat, cold emptiness of a winter sky. He wrote of Valeriano's charisma, a polished, charming veneer that barely concealed a chilling ambition. An undercurrent of fear began to seep into the meticulous script. Ricardo wrote of private meetings, of conversations that felt more like commands. The dreamer was being pulled into the orbit of a predator, and the journal became a chronicle of his growing unease. He felt watched, entangled in something he couldn't see, a spider's web being woven around him and his beloved, isolated cinema. He was afraid. Elena's breath hitched in her throat as she read the entry dated October 12, 1978. It described a late-night summons to this very room. Valeriano had arrived, not with charm, but with two silent, imposing men and a heavy burlap sack. He had emptied its contents onto the desk, a pile of rough, earthy stones that glowed a deep, verdant green under the desk lamp. They were emeralds. Ricardo, the expert, was not asked to appraise them. He was ordered to. He wrote that his blood ran cold. The inclusions, the specific shade of green, the very soul of the stones, he knew them instantly. They were from the Cayamara lands, a sacred local mountain range, a unique geological signature impossible to fake. These were not mined legally, he wrote, his handwriting for the first time becoming a near illegible scrawl. They were ripped from the earth, stolen. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. She looked at the velvet pouches beside her. The treasure was not a gift, it was evidence. The weight of the stones in her memory felt heavier now. The next page explained everything. A confession written in the stark, simple language of absolute horror. Valeriano had engineered a fraudulent claim on the Kayamara territory. The tribe's leader, a respected elder named Arikari, had challenged him with ancestral documents and was gaining traction with federal authorities. The journal entry was short, brutal. Arikari is dead. They say his canoe capsized in the rapids. An accident. Ricardo then wrote the words that made Eleanor's heart stop. The colonel was here tonight. He was celebrating. He told me accidents happen to those who stand in the way of progress. He was smiling. The emeralds were Valeriano's first plunder from the stolen land, and the money in the chest was Ricardo's reward for appraising them and, more importantly, for his silence. The connection was a physical shock, a jolt of ice water through her veins. This wasn't a fortune. It was blood money. She was sitting in a murderer's vault, a tomb of greed. The journal became a litany of self-loathing. Ricardo wrote of his cowardice, his complicity. "I have become a ghost in my own life," one entry read. "I see Arikari's face in every shadow. I hear his voice in the wind that rattles the windows of this theater. The money sits in its steel box like a coffin, and the emeralds feel like the eyes of the dead, watching me." He had hidden it all here, in this secret room, unable to spend it, unable to destroy it, trapped by the evidence of his own sin. He described how Valeriano's power grew, how the colonel systematically erased the Kayamara from the region's history, rewriting maps and records until it was as if they had never existed at all. The entire town of Perdido had become a monument to this lie, left to rot so no one would ever come looking for the truth. Elena now understood the oppressive, heavy silence of the town. It was the silence of a buried crime, a collective grave. The last few pages were written in a shaky, paranoid scrawl. The ink was splotched in places, as if from a trembling hand or a falling tear. "He watches me. I see his men in the town. They ask questions about the theater." Ricardo wrote that Valeriano had made several offers to buy the Majestic, each one more insistent than the last. He doesn't want the land. He wants to tear this building down. He wants to bury this room, bury me, bury the truth under a slab of concrete. Eleanor's fingers traced the final, chilling entry, dated just a week after the previous one. It was 2 short sentences. "He knows. I can feel it. If I am gone tomorrow, know that it was not an accident." And then the journal simply ended. The remaining pages were blank. Elena slammed the book shut, the sound a sharp crack in the silence. Her great-uncle hadn't disappeared. He had been erased, just like Arikari. A profound, suffocating dread settled over Eleanor, colder and heavier than the theater's damp chill. She wasn't just the heir to a dilapidated building, she was the heir to a murder, the guardian of a secret that had already cost at least 2 men their lives. The emeralds were not a path to salvation but a poison, and the journal was a death warrant. The entire history of this place, its decay and isolation, was a carefully constructed crime scene. Valeriano hadn't just left the town to die. He had actively curated its demise, ensuring it would become a forgotten backwater where no one would ever think to look for a secret office and a steel footlocker full of evidence. And now she was here, a loose end, a living, breathing witness who had just stumbled upon the very thing the colonel had spent a lifetime trying to bury. Her heart pounded with a new kind of fear, a primal terror that went beyond hunger or cold. This was the fear of being hunted. Suddenly, a sound from the world outside tore through the sealed silence of the room. It was a low, powerful rumble, a sound utterly alien to the dead quiet of Perdido, the distinct purr of an expensive, well-maintained engine. It grew steadily louder, not passing by but approaching the theater, slowing, stopping. Her blood ran cold. She felt a surge of pure panic, scrambling out of the tiny opening, her limbs clumsy with fear. She tried to push the wooden panel back into place, but it scraped against the damaged frame, refusing to sit flush. It was ajar, a visible scar on the wall. There was no time. She grabbed Leo's blanket, pulling it higher over his sleeping form on the stage, her mind screaming. The heavy, solid thud of a car door closing echoed through the cavernous space, a sound as final and ominous as a gavel strike. They were no longer alone. He was here. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly confident. They weren't the steps of a wanderer or a lost traveler. They were the steps of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Elena's hand instinctively reached for the tire iron she had left on the stage. The cold, heavy steel was a pathetic comfort, but it was all she had. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped it, hiding it behind her back. A tall, imposing shadow fell through the broken side doorway, eclipsing the weak morning light. A moment later, the man himself stepped inside. He was old, perhaps in his late 80s, but he stood with the rigid posture of a soldier, his frame draped in an impeccably tailored dark suit that seemed to absorb the light around it. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He looked like a king visiting a slum, his presence a stark, terrifying violation of the decay around him. His eyes, just as the journal had described them, were the most terrifying thing about him. They were a pale, piercing blue, chips of ice that swept across the ruin with an air of dismissive appraisal. They didn't see the rot or the mold, they saw an obstacle. Then they landed on Elena. They held no surprise, only a cold, calculating curiosity. He took a few steps forward, his expensive leather shoes making soft, predatory sounds on the filthy floor. "I am Mr. Valeriano," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that carried effortlessly in the vast space. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. A faint, cloying scent of expensive cologne reached her, a smell of wealth and power that was nauseatingly out of place. "I was told the last of the Reyes family had come home. A tragic homecoming, it seems." His gaze flickered down to Leo, a cold, analytical look that made Elena's protective instincts flare like a fire. He gestured vaguely at the collapsing ceiling, a parody of sympathy on his face. A sad sight. This place was once the heart of the town. Now, it's just a carcass waiting for a burial. His words were chosen with surgical precision. He spoke of his deep roots in the community, of his desire to see Perdido cleaned up, revitalized. He painted himself as a patriarch, a benevolent caretaker of the region's history. The hypocrisy was so profound, it made Elena feel dizzy. She felt the weight of the journal hidden behind the screen, a silent accusation against this man's every word. He knew she was desperate. He could see it in the way she stood, in the threadbare clothes she wore, in the sick child sleeping on a filthy blanket. He was assessing her, gauging her breaking point, and she could feel his cold intelligence probing her for weaknesses. Then came the offer. "I have been trying to acquire this property for many years, out of a sense of civic duty. It's an eyesore, and frankly, a danger." He named a sum, a number so insultingly small it was barely enough to buy a bus ticket back to the life of desperation she had just fled. He called it a generous offer, a gesture of goodwill to help a young mother in a difficult position. "Take the money, my dear," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "Start over somewhere new, somewhere safe. This is no place for a woman and her child." The words were a threat, wrapped in a ribbon of false concern. He wasn't offering her a way out. He was telling her to run. The cold fury building inside Elena was a surprising new strength. It burned away some of the fear. She gripped the tire iron tighter, clutching the cold steel behind her back. Elena found her voice. It came out stronger than she expected. A low, steady tremor. "It's not for sale. It has sentimental value." Mr. Valeriano's thin smile did not falter, but it became a fixed, lifeless thing. A mask. His eyes, however, changed. The cold curiosity hardened into something ancient and dangerous, the look of a predator whose patience had just run out. He took a single, slow step closer, invading her space, the scent of his cologne suddenly suffocating. "Sentiment is a luxury for those who can afford it," he whispered, his voice losing its cultured smoothness, dropping to a gravelly, menacing tone. "You should reconsider. Old buildings like this, they have so many problems. Faulty wiring, dry rot, fires start so easily." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare, a naked weapon pointed directly at her and her son. He let the words hang in the freezing air, a poison that seeped into every corner of the decaying theatre. "And it is a very isolated place, so far from any help." He glanced again at the sleeping form of Leo, a silent, final turn of the screw. A single mother, a sick little boy. "It would be a tragedy if something were to happen to you out here. Accidents, they happen all the time." He held her gaze for a long, terrifying moment, his icy blue eyes promising consequences she could barely imagine. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible nod, he turned and walked away. The sound of his footsteps receded, followed by the solid thud of the car door and the growl of the engine fading into the distance, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than any sound. Elena stood shaking, the tire iron feeling impossibly light in her hand. She was trapped. She held the truth, and the monster knew it. What would you do in her place? Confront him, knowing he wouldn't hesitate to silence you and your child forever? Or would you take the pittance he offered, run for your lives, and allow his crimes to remain buried with the dead? The silence Valeriano left behind was a living entity, a suffocating presence that was far more terrifying than his words had been. Elena stood frozen in the center of the vast, decaying hall, the cold steel of the tire iron a useless weight in her hand. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a frantic drum signaling a retreat she could not make. His threat was not a future possibility. It was a promise that had already been set in motion, a countdown she could hear in the mournful whistle of the wind through the gaping roof. Her mind reeled, trapped in a dizzying loop of his final words. Accidents happen. She felt a wave of crushing helplessness wash over her, a return of the familiar despair. But this time it was laced with the metallic taste of pure terror. The chill in the air was no longer just the dampness of the ruin. It was the icy touch of her own mortality, a cold dread that seeped into the marrow of her bones. She was a witness, and he was a man who buried his witnesses. Every shadow in the cavernous theater seemed to deepen, to twist into watching shapes. Her gaze darted around the rotting mausoleum, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The car was dead. The nearest town was a day's walk, and she knew, with a certainty that made her stomach clench, that she would be found long before she reached it. Her eyes fell on the tattered movie screen, the place where the secret had been born. The journal. The thought was a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. She stumbled back behind the screen, her movements clumsy with fear, and squeezed through the narrow opening into the secret room. The dust and the smell of old paper filled her lungs. There, on the floor next to the open footlocker, was the leather-bound book. She snatched it up, its familiar weight a strange comfort. Frantically, her fingers flipped through the brittle pages, not reading but searching. She was looking for a name, a place, anything her great-uncle might have mentioned, a breadcrumb he might have left. Her desperation was a prayer, a frantic plea to a dead man to offer one last secret, one path out of this tomb. And then she saw it. It was a name she had skimmed over before, a footnote in the tragic tale of Arikari, the murdered tribal leader. The entry read, "Arikari spoke of his son, Isaias, a boy as sharp and quiet as an obsidian blade. He said he was teaching him the old ways, the stories of the land, so they would not be forgotten." The name had meant nothing to her hours ago. Now, it was a lifeline. Isaias, the son of the man Valeriano had murdered. If he was still alive, if he was still here in this forgotten corner of the world, he would be the only other person who knew the truth of Valeriano's origins, the only one who had a reason to fight. A wild, desperate hope surged through her, so fierce it almost choked her. He might be an old man now, or he might be long gone, another ghost haunting this desolate land. But it was a chance. It was the only move left on the board, a gamble with the highest possible stakes. Her own life and the life of her son were now pinned on the hope that this one man still existed. The decision solidified into a cold, hard resolve. She had to go now. She couldn't wait for Valeriano to make his next move. She looked at the fortune in the chest, the money and the velvet pouches of glowing green stones. They were an anchor, a liability. She couldn't carry it all. She grabbed one small pouch of emeralds, the stones feeling like cold, heavy lumps of dread in her hand, and shoved it deep into her pocket. They were proof. Then she tucked the journal inside her thin jacket, the hard leather pressing against her ribs, a constant, painful reminder of the truth she now carried. She left the rest, the money and the remaining jewels, in the dark belly of the steel chest. Let him find it, she thought with a flash of cold fury. Let it be the thing that damned him. She crawled back out of the secret room, leaving the panel ajar. There was no time for concealment. Every second was precious. She cast one last look at Leo, still sleeping soundly on his pathetic blanket on the stage, a small innocent island in an ocean of decay and danger. Leaving him was the hardest thing she had ever done. The thought of it was a physical agony, a tearing in her chest. But taking him with her, a sick child, on a desperate trek to find a man who might not even exist, was a risk she couldn't take. He was safer here, hidden in the vastness of the theater, than he would be out in the open. "I'll be back, Leo," she whispered, the words a silent vow that felt thin and brittle in the face of her terror. Her hand brushed his hot forehead, a fleeting touch of warmth in the suffocating cold. She backed away slowly, her heart screaming in protest, and slipped out the broken side door. The world outside was a landscape of grey twilight. The wind was sharper now, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. She clutched the journal to her chest and started walking, forcing herself to move away from the theater, away from her son, her every step a betrayal and her only hope. The single, desolate street of Perdido stretched before her like a path into the underworld, lined with the skeletal remains of abandoned homes. The town of Perdido was even more unsettling on foot. It was a place defined by absences, the absence of light, of sound, of life. Her own footsteps on the gravel road seemed unnaturally loud, an intrusion on a sacred, deathly quiet. She felt 1,000 unseen eyes watching her from the dark, vacant windows of the dilapidated houses. Was one of them Valeriano's spy? The thought sent a fresh jolt of fear through her, and she quickened her pace, pulling her thin jacket tighter around her. She had no idea where she was going, only a vague notion that an indigenous community had once lived on the outskirts of the town, near the river. She followed the road as it dissolved into a dirt track, leading her away from the town's corpse and into a forest of gnarled skeletal trees. The air grew colder, and the woods pressed in on all sides, the rustling of leaves sounding like whispers just beyond the edge of her hearing. Her breath came in ragged puffs, her body fueled by a potent, toxic cocktail of adrenaline and pure primal fear. After what felt like an eternity of walking, a flicker of light appeared through the trees. It wasn't the cold, electric light of the modern world, but a warm, gentle, flickering orange. It was a lantern, a fire, a home. As she drew closer, she saw it, a small, sturdy cabin, built of dark, weathered wood, nestled in a small clearing. A thin plume of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a fragile ribbon of life against the bruised purple sky. Unlike the rotting structures of Perdido, this place felt cared for, alive. There were neatly stacked cords of firewood against one wall, and the faint outline of a vegetable garden, asleep for the winter. It was a bastion of order against the encroaching chaos of the wilderness and the decay of the nearby town. Hope, fragile and tentative, fluttered in her chest. She had found it. She approached the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and raised a trembling hand to knock on the weathered wood. The sound was swallowed by the immense silence of the forest. The door creaked open, revealing a man who seemed as old as the trees surrounding his home. He was tall and gaunt, his face a breathtaking landscape of deep-cut lines and weathered dark skin. His long, silver-white hair was tied back in a simple knot at the nape of his neck, but it was his eyes that captured her. They were dark, almost black, and they held a piercing, intelligent light that seemed to see right through her fear and desperation. They were eyes that had witnessed a century of sorrow but had lost none of their fire. He stood silently in the doorway, holding an old oil lantern that cast long, dancing shadows across his face, his expression a mask of cautious neutrality. He didn't speak, just waited, his gaze unwavering. Elena felt her own voice catch in her throat. All the words she had rehearsed on her frantic walk evaporated, leaving her speechless before this silent, formidable figure. She felt like a child, small and insignificant in the face of his immense, ancient presence. I'm looking for Isaias," she finally managed to stammer, her voice a reedy whisper that was nearly lost to the wind. "My name is Elena Reyes, my great-uncle." He owned the Majestic. At the mention of the theater, a flicker of something unreadable passed through the old man's dark eyes. It wasn't surprise, but a deep, weary recognition. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on her, waiting. Elena's hand, shaking uncontrollably, pulled the worn leather journal from her jacket. She held it out to him, a desperate offering. "I found this," she said, her voice growing stronger with a sense of purpose. "It belonged to my great-uncle. It tells the story of what happened. It mentions your father, Arikari. The name fell into the silence between them, like a stone dropped into a deep well. The old man's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The weary neutrality vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid attention. His back straightened, and the fire in his eyes burned brighter, hotter. He looked from her face to the journal, and for the first time he spoke. "I am Isaias," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You had better come inside." The inside of the cabin was a single room, warm and filled with the rich, comforting smell of burning cedar and brewing herbs. The air was thick with history. Woven blankets with intricate geometric patterns adorned the walls, and shelves were filled not with books, but with carefully labeled clay pots, bundles of dried plants, and smooth river stones. A small crackling fire in the stone hearth cast a warm, dancing glow over everything. It was a space that felt both ancient and alive, a stark contrast to the hollow emptiness of the theatre. Isaias gestured for her to sit in a simple wooden chair by the fire, and he took a seat opposite her. He placed the oil lantern on a small table between them, its light illuminating the deep lines of his face. The silence stretched between them, but it was no longer a tense, wary silence. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a great storm or a profound revelation. Elena clutched the journal in her lap, her knuckles white. She was about to unburden herself of a truth that had been buried for 50 years, and she was terrified of the weight it would place on this old man. With a deep, shuddering breath, Elena began to speak. She told him everything, her voice low and urgent in the quiet room. She spoke of her desperation, the dead car, her sick son. She described the decaying theater, the moment Leo's toy car rolled behind the screen, and the discovery of the hidden panel. Her voice cracked as she described the fortune in the chest, the glowing emeralds, and the cold, sinking realization of what they truly were. She opened the journal, her fingers tracing the faded script as she recounted her great-uncle's confession, the coercion, the appraisal of the stolen gems, and the chilling account of Arikari's accidental death. As she spoke, she felt as if she were channeling Ricardo's ghost, giving voice to his guilt and fear after a lifetime of silence. She did not spare herself, admitting her first desperate hope that the treasure was a miracle, a salvation. Before the horrifying truth had crashed down upon her, she was confessing not just her great-uncle's sins, but her own momentary, greedy hope. Isaias listened with an unnerving stillness, his dark eyes never leaving her face. His hands rested on his knees, his long, gnarled fingers perfectly still. He did not react, did not interrupt, his expression an unreadable mask of stoicism. But Eleanor could feel the weight of her words landing on him, could feel the history she was unearthing, resonating in the charged air between them. When she finally fell silent, the story told, the only sounds in the room were the crackling of the fire and the mournful howl of the wind outside the cabin's sturdy walls. She felt drained, hollowed out, as if she had poured the last of her strength into the telling. She looked at Isaias, her heart pounding, waiting for a judgment, a condemnation, a dismissal. She had laid the ugliest secrets of her family at his feet, the story of a crime that had destroyed his own. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, and in it, Elena felt the full, crushing weight of 50 years of injustice. She had done her part. She had delivered the message from the grave. Now everything depended on his response. Finally, after a silence that felt like a lifetime, Isaias nodded slowly, a single, deliberate movement of his head. "I have waited for this story," he said, his voice a low rumble, filled with a profound and ancient sorrow. "My whole life, I have waited." He reached out and took the journal from her, his calloused fingers handling the old leather with a strange reverence, as if it were a sacred object. "My father was no fool," he continued, his gaze distant, lost in a memory from half a century ago. He knew Valeriano was a snake, a man with a hollow soul and an endless hunger. He knew that challenging him was a death sentence, but he believed the truth was more important than one man's life. He believed the land had a spirit, and that spirit was crying out. His words painted a portrait of Arikari, not as a victim, but as a warrior who had knowingly walked into a battle he could not personally survive, but that he hoped future generations could win. Elena felt a powerful wave of shame for her great-uncle's cowardice, a stark contrast to the bravery of the man Isaias described. He told me about the room in the theatre, Isaias revealed, his dark eyes locking onto Elena's. He and your great-uncle were friends. Once, before Valeriano poisoned everything. Ricardo loved stories and my father loved the land. They understood each other. My father knew that if the worst happened, Ricardo's conscience would be his prison and that hidden room would be its cell. He told me, the truth will sleep there in that place of lies and flickering shadows until someone with a clean heart comes to wake it up. Elena felt a shiver run down her spine. The words were a prophecy, an echo from the past that had just found its fulfillment. She was the one with the clean heart, not because of any inherent virtue, but because she had nothing left to lose. She had come to the theatre not seeking a fortune, but a simple roof, and had stumbled into a destiny that had been waiting for her, woven into the very fabric of her family's shameful history. The weight on her shoulders felt immense, but for the first time, it also felt purposeful. Your great-uncle's story is the soul of the crime, Isaias said, tapping the cover of the journal. It proves the murder. It proves the motive. But it is a ghost story without a body. It needs a foundation. It needs the land itself. He rose from his chair with a slow, deliberate grace that belied his age and walked to a large, carved wooden chest in the corner of the room. He knelt and lifted the heavy lid, revealing a collection of blankets and ceremonial objects. He reached deep inside and retrieved a long, flat parcel wrapped in oilskin and tied with leather cord. The package was dark and stained with age, and it seemed to exude an aura of importance. He brought it back to the fire and placed it carefully on the table between them. My father was a warrior, Isaias said, his voice thick with emotion. He did not go into his final battle unarmed. He prepared for his own death. He gave me this the night before his accident, and he made me swear to protect it until the story in the theatre was ready to be told. With fingers that were surprisingly nimble, Isaias untied the leather cord and unrolled the oilskin wrapping. Inside lay a collection of papers, yellowed and brittle with age, but perfectly preserved. The top document was a map, hand-drawn with exquisite detail, showing the ancestral boundaries of the Cayamara territory. Beneath it were official-looking documents bearing the seal of the Pre-Valeriano territorial government, their script faded but legible. This is the original land grant, Isaias explained, his finger tracing the elegant lines of the map. The true one, registered with the federal authorities 100 years ago. It proves our claim. It proves our existence. Eleanor stared at the papers, her heart pounding. This was it. This was the foundation. But there was one more document at the bottom of the stack, a single folded sheet of paper. Isaias picked it up, his expression hardening. And this, he said, his voice dropping to a low, cold whisper, is the body. He unfolded the paper and laid it on the table. It was a handwritten letter, a confession. The surveyor, Isaias said, his voice filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. Valeriano forced him to create the forged documents, the ones the colonel used to file his fraudulent claim. The man was eaten by his guilt. He came to my father in secret and wrote this sworn affidavit detailing the entire scheme. How Valeriano threatened his family. How he was forced to create a false map and a backdated deed. Elena stared at the confession, at the shaky signature at the bottom. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening finality. Ricardo's journal provided the narrative of the murder, the motive, the blood money. These documents provided the irrefutable, legal proof of the underlying crime that had set everything in motion. It was an unbreakable chain of evidence, forged across 50 years of silence and grief. They had him. They had everything they needed to tear Valeriano's empire of lies down to its very foundations. A fierce, burning rage, cold and clean, swept through Eleanor, burning away the last vestiges of her fear. Suddenly, the relative peace of the cabin was shattered. A sharp, frantic rap came at the door. Both Isaias and Elena froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. A voice called out from the darkness, a voice Elena recognized with a jolt of alarm. It was the old woman who ran the nearly abandoned general store in Perdido, the only other soul she had seen in the town. "Isaias!" the woman cried, her voice thin and panicked. "Isaias, you have to know. Thomas, the one who watches things for the Colonel. He saw the woman come here. He just left the store, made a call from the payphone. I heard him. He told them she was with you. He told them to finish it. Tonight, the warning hung in the air. A death knell. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The rage vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, primal terror that was colder and sharper than anything she had ever felt. It was a terror not for herself, but for her son, Leo. He was still there, alone in the theatre, in the direct path of the monster's wrath. Panic, white-hot and absolute, seized her. "Leo," she gasped, the name a strangled cry. She lunged for the door, her mind a screaming void of pure terror. Isaias grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong like steel bands. "Wait!" he commanded, his voice a sharp crack of authority that cut through her hysteria. "Going back now is what they expect. You will be walking into a trap." But Elena couldn't hear him. The only sound in her ears was the imagined sound of her son's frightened cries. She ripped her arm from his grasp, her eyes wild. "He's there! He's alone!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. She threw the cabin door open and plunged into the oppressive darkness of the forest, the old woman's warning echoing in her ears. They said to finish it, to burn it all. The words propelled her forward, her feet stumbling over roots and rocks she couldn't see. The cold night air burned in her lungs as she ran, her every frantic heartbeat a drumbeat of doom. She had to get back. She had to get to Leo. The forest was a nightmare of grasping branches and disorienting shadows. Elena ran with a reckless, desperate speed, her only guide the faint, ominous glow in the sky that marked the location of the dying town. The journal and Isaias's documents were still clutched in her hand, a cold, hard lump against her palm, but she was barely aware of them. Her entire universe had contracted to a single, terrifying point. Her son, alone in that rotting tinderbox. The sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of some unseen creature in the undergrowth, all sounded like the footsteps of pursuing men. Paranoia was a physical presence at her back, breathing down her neck. She burst out of the tree line, her lungs screaming, and saw the theatre looming at the end of the street. And then she heard it, a sound that didn't belong, the low, guttural rumble of a truck engine idling in the shadows near the building. Her heart stopped. It wasn't Valeriano's silent, expensive car. It was something rougher, more brutal, and then the smell hit her, cutting through the night air and the familiar scent of decay. It was a sharp, sickeningly sweet chemical odor that made her stomach turn, gasoline. The scent was thick, pervasive, a promise of fire and death. Her frantic run slowed to a stealthy, terrified crawl. She ducked behind the crumbling remains of a brick wall across the street, her body trembling uncontrollably. Peering through a gap in the bricks, she saw them. Two figures, large and menacing, moved like shadows around the base of the theatre. The beams of their flashlights cut sharp, agitated patterns across the decaying facade. They were carrying large red metal cans, and with swift, methodical movements, they were dousing the walls, the boarded-up entrance, the very foundations of the building. They were anointing it for its funeral pyre. Elena clamped a hand over her own mouth to stifle a scream, the taste of dirt and terror on her tongue. One of the men paused, his flashlight beam catching the broken side door where she had entered and exited. He said, "Make sure to get it all." A low, gravelly voice growled, the words carrying clearly on the cold night air. "The Colonel wants it gone, everything, and everyone inside." The other man laughed. A short, ugly bark of a sound. "A little girl and her kid. They won't even know what hit 'em." The casual brutality of their words was a physical blow, knocking the air from Elena's lungs. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was an execution. Her mind flashed to Leo asleep on the stage, completely oblivious, breathing in the fumes that were soaking into the floorboards beneath him. A rage so pure and white-hot it burned away her terror, momentarily flooded her veins. They were going to murder her child. The thought was an impossible, unacceptable reality that she refused to allow. In that instant, she was no longer a victim. She was a mother, and there was nothing on earth more dangerous. Her mind, sharpened by the adrenaline and the primal need to protect her son, raced with a desperate clarity. The front was impossible. The side door was watched. She scanned the building, her eyes tracing its familiar, ruined silhouette. And then, a memory from the journal surfaced. a lifeline thrown from the grave, a marginal note, scrawled by her great-uncle in a moment of paranoia. Cellar access under the north side of the stage, old bootlegger's tunnel, exits in the woods behind the property, a final escape, should the ghosts come for me. The ghosts were here, and the escape route was their only chance. She had to get inside, get to Leo, and get to that trap door before the first match was struck. There was a row of higher narrow windows along the back wall of the theatre, near the stage, most of them shattered. It was a risk. They might see her, but it was the only way. With a deep, silent prayer, she broke cover and began to move, a shadow among shadows, her target the back of the building. She moved with a stealth she didn't know she possessed, her feet silent on the overgrown grass and debris. The voices of the men grew fainter as she rounded the back corner of the immense building. The gasoline smell was stronger here, almost suffocating. She reached the rear wall and found a window that was low enough, its glass long gone, the opening a jagged black maw. She listened, holding her breath, her ears straining. All she could hear was the wind and the pounding of her own blood. She hoisted herself up, scraping her hands on the broken glass, and tumbled through the opening, landing in a crouch on the dusty floor inside. She was behind the stage. The darkness was almost absolute, but she could smell the familiar rot, now mixed with the terrifying scent of fuel. She could hear Leo's soft, rhythmic breathing just a few feet away. He was still safe. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees, washed over her, quickly followed by a fresh surge of adrenaline. There was no time. She crawled to him, her movements swift and silent. "Leo," she whispered, her voice a raw, urgent hiss as she gently shook his shoulder. "Leo, wake up. We have to go. Now." He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, confused and bleary with sleep and fever. "Mama," he mumbled, his voice thick. "Shh," she whispered, pressing a finger to his lips. "We have to play a game. A very quiet game." He was too groggy to argue. She scooped his small, warm body into her arms. He felt impossibly heavy. She could hear the men's voices now from the main hall, their heavy boots stomping on the floorboards on the other side of the stage curtain. They were inside. Time had run out. Clutching Leo to her chest with one arm, she used her free hand to feel her way under the lip of the stage, her fingers searching desperately in the thick dust and debris for the detail from the journal. A cold, iron ring. Her fingers brushed against it. The trapdoor. With a strength born of pure terror, she pulled on the iron ring. It resisted, sealed shut by decades of grime and disuse. She grunted, pulling with all her might, her muscles screaming in protest. The men's voices were closer now, just on the other side of the tattered screen. "Start here," one of them said. "Let's make sure it goes up fast." With a final, desperate heave, the trapdoor gave way, groaning open with a sound of splintering wood that seemed deafeningly loud in the tense silence. It revealed a square of perfect, subterranean blackness and a rush of cold, damp, earthy air. It was the smell of salvation. Without a moment's hesitation, she swung her legs into the opening, Leo clinging to her neck like a limpet. She found the first rung of a wooden ladder and began to descend into the oppressive, unknown dark of the cellar below. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a prayer. "Hurry, hurry, hurry!" her mind screamed. Just as her feet touched the damp, stone floor of the cellar, a sudden, bright orange light flashed through the cracks in the stage floorboards above. It was followed an instant later by a deep, guttural whoosh, a sound like a giant beast taking a sudden, fiery breath. A wave of intense heat washed down into the cellar, and the terrifying, hungry roar of a rapidly spreading fire filled the air. The crackle of consuming flames was punctuated by the sound of the men's triumphant laughter, a sound that quickly turned to shouts of alarm as the fire grew faster and hotter than they had anticipated. Elena didn't wait to hear more. She reached up, grabbed the edge of the trapdoor, and pulled it shut, plunging them into absolute, suffocating darkness. The roar of the fire was now a muffled thunder above them. The only light the faint, flickering orange that bled through the seams of the door. They were alive. They were underground. And above them, the majestic, her cursed inheritance, and their only shelter, was being devoured by the inferno. Clutching Leo tightly, Elena fumbled in her pocket, her fingers closing around her phone. She switched on its flashlight, the beam cutting a weak, shaky circle through the profound darkness. They were in a narrow, stone-lined tunnel. The air was frigid and smelled of wet earth, stone, and a faint, lingering scent of old moonshine. The roar of the fire was a constant, terrifying rumble behind them. There was only one way to go, forward. She began to run, her feet splashing in puddles of icy water, Leo's head buried in her shoulder. The tunnel was long and straight, a black throat leading them away from the inferno. The documents from Isaias and her great-uncle's journal were still clutched in her hand, the paper now damp and cold. They were the only things that mattered, the truth she had rescued from the flames. Behind them, the glow from the burning theater was a distant, fading memory. Ahead of them lay the woods, the unknown, and the faint, fragile hope of Isaias's cabin. They were fugitives now, running for their lives with the evidence of a 50-year-old crime. They burst from the mouth of the tunnel into the freezing night air, gasping for breath, the roar of the inferno a monstrous beast at their backs. The forest around them was bathed in a hellish, dancing orange glow as the majestic, the monument to her family's shame, was consumed by flames. Elena's lungs burned, her body screaming with exhaustion, but she clutched Leo to her chest, his small body trembling violently, and then she saw him. Isaias stood by a tall pine, a still calm figure in the swirling chaos, the oilskin-wrapped documents held securely under his arm. He wasn't panicked. He was waiting. His dark eyes found hers through the smoke-filled gloom, and in them she saw not fear, but the cold, hard glint of a warrior whose moment had finally arrived. He strode toward them, his presence a grounding force amidst the terror. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "They have made their final mistake," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Now, we bring the dawn." It wasn't over. It was just beginning. Isaias led them deeper into the woods, to a place where the fire's roar faded to a distant murmur. From a hollowed-out log, he retrieved a small, rugged satellite phone, an object so out of place in his ancient world that it felt like magic. With practiced fingers, he dialed a number from memory. Eleanor listened, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. As he began to speak in low, urgent tones, he spoke to a lawyer in the capital, a woman named Sophia, whose name he spoke with immense respect. He described her as a jaguar, relentless and brilliant, a specialist in indigenous rights who had been waiting for a case like this her whole life. As he relayed the story, the journal, the documents, the fire, the emeralds clutched in Elena's own pocket, Elena could almost feel the energy shift hundreds of miles away. She could hear the faint, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, the sound of a powerful legal machine roaring to life, its gears lubricated by 50 years of injustice and fueled by a fresh act of violent rage. The dawn did not come with the sun, but with the sound of rotor blades chopping the sky. It started as a distant thrumming and grew into a powerful, percussive beat that vibrated through the ground. Two sleek, black helicopters, bearing no markings, descended into a clearing near Isaias's cabin, their downdraft whipping the trees into a frenzy. Federal police, men in dark tactical gear, their faces grim and professional, secured the perimeter. Sophia, the lawyer, stepped out of one of the helicopters. She was a woman in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. The meeting took place in Isaias's cabin, the air thick with the smell of cedar and the electric tension of imminent justice. Elena, her hands still shaking, laid out the evidence on the old wooden table. Ricardo's journal, its pages whispering of murder. Isaias's ancestral map, its lines rewriting history. The surveyor's confession. And finally, the small pouch of raw emeralds, which she emptied onto the table. The stones glowed a deep, malevolent green in the lantern light, their silence screaming the truth. The raid on the Valeriano estate was a silent, swift, and brutal symphony of justice. While the colonel ate his breakfast, served on fine china in a sun-drenched room overlooking his stolen lands, the federal police descended. There were no sirens, no warnings. Black-clad agents swept through the manicured gardens, disabling his private security with cold efficiency. Valeriano looked up from his morning paper, a flicker of annoyance on his face at the disturbance, just as the heavy oak doors to his dining room splintered inward. He saw not local deputies he could buy, but the cold, implacable faces of federal power. His aura of untouchability evaporated in an instant. The faint, arrogant smile froze on his lips as he was hauled from his chair. The sound of his indignant, sputtering protests about his rights and his influence was abruptly cut off by the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs closing around his wrinkled wrists. In that moment, surrounded by the opulent splendor bought with blood, he was no longer a colonel. He was just a withered, terrified old man, his empire of lies collapsing around him. The trial became a national spectacle, a story of buried history unearthed. Sophia, the Jaguar lawyer, was masterful. She didn't just present a case, she resurrected ghosts. She had excerpts from Ricardo's journal read into the official record, his terrified, guilt-ridden voice finally speaking its truth in the sterile courtroom. Isaias took the stand, not as a victim, but as the proud son of a murdered leader, his quiet dignity and unwavering testimony captivating the nation. He spoke of the land as a living entity, of a culture systematically erased. The media hung on every word. Valeriano, stripped of his tailored suits and his power, shrank in the defendant's box. He became a symbol of a corrupt, bygone era. When the surveyor's confession was read, confirming the fraudulent maps and deeds, the final nail was driven into his coffin. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, but its delivery was a thunderclap of catharsis. Guilty on all counts: murder, fraud, theft. His life sentence was a quiet end to a lifetime of loud, violent greed, his name now synonymous not with power, but with shame. The fall of Valeriano was only the beginning. The court's subsequent rulings were a series of seismic shocks that redrew the map of Perdido and restored a stolen legacy. The fraudulent land claims Valeriano had built his empire on were declared null and void. In a historic judgment, the court officially recognized the Cayamara's ancestral rights, returning the vast tracts of land, including the sacred mountain, to Isaias and the handful of remaining tribal families. The cache of emeralds, both those found in the theater and others seized from Valeriano's vaults, was ruled as blood money. They were placed into a multi-million-dollar trust, managed by Sophia's firm, dedicated to the Cayamara people, to fund education, healthcare, and the rebuilding of their community. Elena watched as Isaias stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, his hand resting on the trunk of an ancient tree. He didn't speak, but tears streamed down his weathered face, each one washing away a piece of a 50-year-old sorrow. The land and its spirit had finally come home. Eleanor had expected nothing. She had acted not for reward, but for her son's survival and for the memory of the dead. But the law had its own logic. As the individual who had uncovered the evidence that brought down Valeriano's criminal enterprise, the court awarded her a substantial portion of his seized, non-tribal assets as a finder's fee and for damages incurred. The number, when Sophia told her, was so large it seemed unreal, a sequence of zeros that her mind couldn't process. She saw it later, on a banking app on a new and uncracked phone. For a long, silent moment, she just stared at the screen. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the giddy thrill of winning a lottery. It was a profound, full-body exhalation, a release of a tension she had carried in her muscles and bones her entire life. It was the feeling of a crushing weight, the constant, gnawing anxiety of poverty lifting from her soul. The suffocating fear of not having enough was gone. She put her head in her hands and wept, not with sadness or joy, but with the sheer, overwhelming relief of being able to finally breathe. The new house was filled with light. The air smelled not of mold and animal waste, but of lemon polish, baking bread, and the rich, savory aroma of a beef stew simmering on the stove. This was her kitchen, warm and bright, a world away from the cold, dead car and the rotting theater. Leo sat at a large wooden table, not shivering under a thin blanket, but bathed in the afternoon sun, his cheeks full and rosy. He wasn't rationing crackers. He was complaining that he was too full for dinner. He wasn't clutching a single, grimy toy car. He was surrounded by a sea of colorful building blocks, constructing a wobbly tower that threatened to collapse at any moment. He coughed once, a small, clear sound to get her attention, and the absence of that wet, ragged sickness was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Elena stood by the counter, not counting her last $47. but unrolling a set of architectural blueprints, her calloused fingers tracing the lines of a future she was now empowered to build herself, a future free from fear. The Majestic rose from its own ashes, not as a ghost, but as a beacon. Using her newfound resources and in partnership with the Kayamara Trust, Elena didn't just rebuild the theatre, she redeemed it. The facade was restored to its former glory, the marquee glowing brightly at night, but the name was different. The Majestic Kayamara Cultural Center. Inside, it was a place of healing. The main auditorium once again showed movies, but it also hosted tribal council meetings and cultural festivals. One wing became a museum, its central exhibit telling the unvarnished truth of Arikari, Valeriano, and the stolen lands, ensuring no one would ever forget. The hidden office behind the stage was preserved behind a wall of reinforced glass, the empty steel footlocker and a replica of the journal sitting inside, a permanent monument to a secret that refused to stay buried. The building was no longer a tomb of lies, but a living testament to justice, a legacy of courage she was building for her son, a home for a whole community that had finally been given its voice back. In her new sewing room, a gentle, contented hum filled the air. It was the sound of her own top-of-the-line sewing machine, a machine she'd once only dreamed of. The rhythm was steady and calm, the sound of creation, not the frantic, desperate pulse of survival. Her hands, nimble and sure, guided a piece of rich fabric under the needle. She was piecing together a magnificent quilt, its design the intricate lines of the Kayamara mountain, its colors the deep greens of the forest and the clear blue of the sky. Leo was fast asleep down the hall, safe and warm in his own bed, in his own room, in his own home. A profound sense of peace settled over Elena, a quiet contentment that felt more valuable than any fortune. She had walked through the deepest darkness and had not just found a light, but had become one. Stories like Elena's remind us that hope is not a luxury, but a weapon, and that the courage of one person can be enough to rewrite history. If you believe that justice is worth fighting for, subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss another story of triumph against all odds.